One of El Chapo's four sons pleads guilty to drug trafficking and the kidnapping of El Mayo, the former president of Honduras, who last year was convicted of cocaine trafficking and sentenced to 45 years in the United States, has been pardoned. All of that and much more in this week's edition of Organized Crime News Weekly. On Monday, December 1st, Joaquin Guzman Lopez, one of the four sons of Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, the legendary Mexican cartel boss, who he and his brothers inherited his criminal empire from after his extradition in 2017, pleaded guilty to charges of being a part of a drug conspiracy, as well as being a member of a continuing criminal enterprise in a Chicago courtroom. This comes after he initially pleaded not guilty. Guzman Lopez admitted to trafficking more than 36 kilograms of fentanyl, 90 kilograms of heroin, 450 kilograms of cocaine, 45 kilograms of methamphetamine, and 90,000 kilograms of marijuana. He also admitted to his role in the kidnapping of Ismael El Mayo Zambada in July of 2024, which simultaneously saw his surrender to the American authorities. Joaquin Guzman Lopez is from El Chapo's second marriage to Griselda Guadalupe Lopez. He is the full brother of Ovidio Guzman Lopez and the younger half-brother of Ivan Archibaldo Guzman Salazar and Jesus Alfredo Guzman Salazar. The four brothers would all follow their father El Chapo into the drug trade at a young age. Joaquin is probably the most obscure of the four Chapitos, as he operated very discreetly compared to his brothers. Another full brother of Joaquin's and Ovidio's was Edgar, who was murdered in 2008. After Edgar's murder, it is thought that both Joaquin and Ovidio started playing a much larger role in their father's drug empire, with both of them overseeing synthetic drug labs that produced both meth and fentanyl. After the extradition of El Chapo in 2017, the four Chapitos took over his faction of the Sinaloa cartel. However, in January of 2023, Ovidio was arrested in a joint operation between the Mexican and American militaries and was extradited to the United States later that year on charges of the trafficking of drugs such as fentanyl and cocaine. In order to help his brother receive a lighter sentence, as well as securing a more lenient sentence for himself if prosecuted in the United States, Joaquin made a calculated and risky move in July of 2024 that would forever alter the landscape of the Mexican drug trade. On July 25, 2024, Joaquin allegedly arranged a meeting in Culiacan, Sinaloa to solve a dispute between Mexican drug traffickers and corrupt politicians in Sinaloa. At that meeting, he requested the presence of Ismael El Mayo Zambada, who had co-founded the Sinaloa cartel back in the 1980s with his father El Chapo, to act as a mediator in this meeting between traffickers and politicians. Once at the meeting, Joaquin allegedly pulled El Mayo aside into a room where he proceeded to lock the door. Once locked inside, several armed men entered the room through an open window and blindfolded and handcuffed El Mayo before taking him outside and placing him into the back of a pickup truck. The truck then drove to an airfield, and El Mayo was then forcibly placed on a private plane and was joined on the plane by Joaquin. The plane crossed the border into the United States, eventually touching down on a small airport in southern New Mexico. Joaquin and El Mayo were promptly arrested by U.S. authorities and taken into custody on a multitude of charges, with Joaquin being extradited to face charges in Chicago and El Mayo in New York. This betrayal by Joaquin would eventually lead a couple months later to the rupturing of the Sinaloa cartel when El Mayo's faction, now led by son Ismael Mayito Flaco Zambada Siqueiros, retaliated against the Chapitos and their faction, leading to the war between the two that has not subsided since then and has seen more than 4,000 killed and a couple thousand kidnappings, with no end in sight. Rumors had been circulating ever since his arrest last year that Joaquin was negotiating a deal for himself and his brother, and those rumors were confirmed with his guilty plea this week, which comes just 5 months after Ovidio pleaded guilty to his charges and 3 months after El Mayo pled guilty as well. It is thought that Ovidio and Joaquin Guzman Lopez are willing to collaborate with the American authorities in the future in order to continue to curry favor and receive leniency. But despite this potential collaboration, he still faces a minimum penalty of 10 years imprisonment and a maximum sentence of life imprisonment upon sentencing. And so, with the guilty plea of Joaquin Guzman Lopez this past week, the U.S. authorities have now taken down two of the four Chapitos. Ivan Archivaldo and Jesus Alfredo are still at large in Mexico, leading the Chapitos as they wage war against El Mayo's faction. It remains to be seen if they are ever captured or killed, but I'm pretty sure that someday in the not too distant future, they both will probably join their brothers in the United States, facing a multitude of charges. I'm interested to see how Joaquin and his brother Ovidio's cooperation will potentially see them serve lighter sentences. It's possible that their cooperation will allow them to re-enter society when they're still at a relatively young age. But regardless of the guilty plea of Joaquin this past week, the Sinaloa cartel continues to fracture, with the war raging back in Sinaloa. And to me, it's only a matter of time before the brand of the Sinaloa cartel completely disintegrates to make way for other cartels, most notably the Jalisco New Generation cartel. And I feel like this cooperation that Joaquin and Ovidio are offering to the American authorities will definitely weaken the image of the Sinaloa cartel, particularly the Chapitos, as it shows that they are willing to make agreements with the Americans, and this will bolster their rivals who can claim that Ovidio and Joaquin are collaborators and that they are weak leaders. But this is just another nail in the coffin of the powerful but increasingly fragmented Sinaloa cartel. On Thursday, December 4th, Tse Chi Lop, perhaps the biggest and most successful drug trafficker of all time, who was nicknamed Asia's El Chapo, was sentenced to 16 years imprisonment in an Australian court after he pleaded guilty on November 7th to trafficking commercial quantities of methamphetamine into Australia, specifically from 2012 to 2013. He will not be eligible for parole for 10 years. This comes after Tse has already been in custody in Australia for the past 3 years after he was extradited from the Netherlands, where he had been arrested in 2021. Tse had been a prime target of the Australian authorities since 2012, when they launched Operation Volante to investigate his drug empire. And now some background on Tse Chi Lop. Born in 1963, Tse Chi Lop is originally from Guangzhou, China, and at a young age joined the Big Circle Boys, a gang formed in China in the late 1960s, made up initially of former members of the Red Guards, a paramilitary organization formed by Mao Zedong during China's Cultural Revolution. The gang would soon migrate to Hong Kong and eventually across the world, most notably Canada, establishing themselves as international players in heroin trafficking. Tse would be amongst the Big Circle Boys members who would migrate to Canada, arriving in 1988 along with his wife, settling in Toronto. Initially working legitimate jobs in Canada, Tse would soon turn back to criminality and greatly expand the power and influence of the Big Circle Boys in Toronto. Tse managed to establish strong contacts with heroin producers in Southeast Asia's Golden Triangle, and this allowed him to flood Canada with heroin throughout the 1990s. While in Canada, he established strong working relationships with the Rizzuto clan of Montreal, as well as with members of the Five Families in New York, whom he supplied with heroin. However, Tse's empire in North America would come crashing down by the late 1990s. An investigation by the FBI saw Tse arrested in August of 1995, along with other associates, and charged with conspiracy to traffic heroin. In 1998, he pleaded guilty to these charges and was given a 9-year sentence, which he would serve at the Federal Correctional Institution in Elkton, Ohio. Tse was released in 2006, and what he would accomplish after his release would far surpass anything he had accomplished previously. After his release, he would focus his activities around methamphetamine and other synthetic drugs rather than heroin, due to the declining demand of heroin and the greater profit margins offered by synthetic drugs. Around this time, heroin producers in the Golden Triangle had also largely shifted to producing synthetic drugs, and Tse was able to reestablish his links with the traffickers out of the Golden Triangle. Tse left Canada in 2010 following the end of his probation and relocated to Hong Kong. He was then able to bring 3 of the most powerful Chinese triads, the 14K, Wo Xingwo, Sun Yiyan, and his former gang, the Big Circle Boys, along with Taiwan's Bamboo Union, together as the group that would come to be known as Sam Gore, with himself as its leader. With the combination of the resources of all these powerful organizations and Tse's business acumen, Sam Gore in a few years would go on to control 70% of the $90 billion Asia-Pacific drug trade, trafficking meth, ketamine, and eventually fentanyl, produced in remote labs in Myanmar, across Asia and Australia, with revenues said to have peaked at $17.7 billion. The success of Sam Gore is largely due to the organization's guarantee that any shipment of drugs seized would be replaced free of charge to the buyer. Sam Gore established strong links with groups such as the Japanese Yakuza, along with the most powerful trafficking organizations in Australia, such as the Comanchero Motorcycle Club and others. This led to Sam Gore being responsible for most of the meth hitting Australia's shores at a time when the country is said to be the most lucrative and expensive market for drugs throughout the world. Tse Chi Lop's downfall started in 2019 after Reuters released an article which exposed his criminal activities. Before this article, he had been completely unknown to the general public and was only known by the people investigating him. The events that would lead to Tse's arrest came at the height of the COVID pandemic when in January of 2021 he was kicked out of Taiwan, where he had been residing for several years at that point. The Taiwanese authorities notified the Australian and Dutch authorities that he was then headed to the Netherlands, as he had already been charged with trafficking offenses by the Australians. Upon his arrival in the Netherlands, Tse was promptly arrested and in July was extradited to Australia, where he has been ever since. One of the conditions of the Dutch authorities extraditing Tse to Australia was that he be sentenced to 25 years max in prison, when the charges he was facing can sometimes lead to life imprisonment. This is the reason for his mere 16-year sentence that was handed down this week. He has only 12 years left when taken into account his incarceration in Australia so far. Tse is also likely to be deported back to China upon his release. To me, this seems like a very anticlimactic judgment handed down to arguably the most successful drug trafficker of not just recent times, but probably of all time. 16 years is nothing, especially when taken into consideration that he's already served 4 of those years. I don't really care personally what kind of sentence he gets, but to me it seems like he would get a much larger sentence considering how notorious and influential he was in the international meth trade. To me, I'm curious as to why there was this prerequisite for him to get no more than 25 years, for him to be extradited from the Netherlands to Australia. I don't know why the Dutch authorities would be so adamant about that. It's not like Tse Chi Lop was a Dutch citizen. But it's kind of incredible that Tse Chi Lop was given only a 16-year sentence, especially considering there are criminals much lower on the food chain than him that sometimes get life sentences for simply trafficking meth. To me, it seems like there's a lot of injustice there, especially considering the magnitude of Tse Chi Lop. It's also interesting to think that Tse Chi Lop, when he gets out of prison in 10 to 12 years, despite the fact by then he'll be in his mid-70s, he could still come back in a big way and be a major player in the international drug trade, despite his old age. I think he could very easily slide back into his old role if given the chance and if he's released early, but that remains to be seen in the years to come. But one thing I know for sure is that the takedown of Tse Chi Lop is going to have zero impact on the international meth and synthetic drug trade, especially in Southeast Asia. His organization that he created, Sam Gore, continues to operate at a high level. Even recently in the Philippines, there were large seizures of meth that were said to belong to Sam Gore. Sam Gore is also said to have a strong presence still in Canada, operating synthetic drug labs producing fentanyl and meth. There are also allegations that Sam Gore has very strong ties to the Chinese Communist Party, and there are rumors that the Chinese Communist Party is using organizations like Sam Gore to sow chaos in the West, as well as to contribute funds to the Chinese Communist Party's coffers. I don't know if I 100% believe them at this point. There may be a lot of anti-Chinese hysteria in these theories, so I don't 100% believe them at this point. But Sam Gore continues to thrive in the international synthetic drug market, and Tse Chi Lop's light sentence, to me, sends a strong message that no matter how high up the food chain in the international drug market, sometimes justice can evade you, and in Tse's case, he may one day be released and continue where he left off. On December 1st, former president of Honduras and convicted cocaine trafficker Juan Orlando Hernandez was released from the United States Penitentiary in Hazleton, West Virginia, after being pardoned by the Trump administration. This comes after he was convicted last year of conspiracy to traffic cocaine, along with weapons charges in a New York court, and sentenced to 45 years imprisonment. But luckily for Hernandez, he only had to serve 19 months. This decision has generated much controversy, especially considering the United States and their recent actions in the Caribbean, bombing boats they allege are carrying cocaine from South America. Prior to his incarceration, Juan Orlando Hernandez had been a powerful figure in Honduran politics for more than 2 decades as part of Honduras's ruling party, the right-wing National Party. Initially a congressman from Honduras' Lempira department, he was elected president of Honduras' National Congress in 2010. In 2013, he was elected president of Honduras. During his time as president, Hernandez would ironically become a staunch ally of the United States and their perceived war on drugs, as Honduras has long been a transshipment point for cocaine heading to the United States from South America and has long been dogged by gang violence, at one point being the most murderous country in the world. Prior to allegations of being involved in cocaine trafficking, Hernandez was long accused of corrupt practices, such as when his sister Hilda ran the country's Ministry of Social Development and Inclusion, and it was found that about $360 million had been misappropriated. It also later came out that embezzled government funds had been funneled into his 2013 presidential campaign. The president's ties to the cocaine trade would first come to light with the arrest of his brother Tony in Miami, Florida in 2018. Tony Hernandez, himself a former member of the National Congress of Honduras, was arrested for running a cocaine trafficking ring that moved tons of cocaine to the United States from 2004 to 2016. He had also allegedly had multiple people murdered, including a former business partner. In 2019, Tony was convicted for cocaine trafficking in the United States and sentenced to life imprisonment. Around this time is when witnesses started making allegations regarding President Hernandez and his ties to the cocaine trade. It was alleged by trafficker and former mayor of the town of El Paraiso, Alexander Ardon, that Tony Hernandez had offered him protection for contributing to his brother's presidential campaign. President Hernandez was accused of taking substantial bribes from prominent Honduran drug traffickers such as Giovanni Fuentes Ramirez, who visited the presidential palace on numerous occasions. It was revealed in Tony Hernandez's trial in 2019 that none other than Joaquin El Chapo Guzman personally flew to Honduras in 2013 and delivered $1 million to Tony, who then used it to finance his brother's successful presidential campaign. It is said that the Sinaloa cartel also provided a further $2.4 million to Hernandez's campaign, obviously to bribe Hernandez and allow Sinaloan cocaine to freely move through the country. The president also is said to have acted as a protector for the Valley Valleys, a notorious cocaine trafficking family in Honduras, who are said to have donated $4 million to his first presidential campaign. The bribes taken by President Hernandez to protect these cocaine traffickers, including his brother, eventually turned Honduras into a major thoroughfare for cocaine heading from South America to Mexico and then on to the United States, in which members of the police and military even played a role. A former trafficker protected by Hernandez stated that the president once said to him, quote, "We are going to shove the drugs up the noses of the gringos and they won't even know it," end quote. These allegations would eventually lead to him being indicted by the United States for facilitating cocaine trafficking. Juan Orlando Hernandez was finally arrested in February of 2022 in an operation by the Honduran police and DEA. This came just 1 month after he stepped down as president. Former President Hernandez was extradited to the United States a couple months later, in April, before he was convicted and sentenced to 45 years imprisonment in 2024. His pardon this past week came just 1 day after the Honduran general election. There's a lot to take away from Hernandez's pardon this past week. To me, this just shows how full of shit the United States' war on drugs is. They're perfectly willing to bomb a bunch of boats in the Caribbean that likely don't even have drugs on them. They're willing to take out the lowest operators on the food chain. But when it comes to a former politician like Juan Orlando Hernandez, they're willing to give him a complete pass, even though he turned his country into a narco state, allowing cocaine to freely move through the country, while he pocketed millions from these traffickers who paid him to look the other way, including his own brother. Pretty infuriating when corrupt politicians help each other out, and this is a perfect example of that. Hernandez was looking at spending pretty much the rest of his life in prison, but because of the interference of politicians who allegedly are anti-drug and going after cocaine traffickers, because of their efforts, he's able to walk free after not even serving 2 years of his 45-year sentence. The hypocrisy is astounding in this case. And if there's any indication that America's war on drugs is a complete and utter failure, the pardon of former President Juan Orlando Hernandez is the biggest indication that the war on drugs has been a complete failure more than anything else in recent memory, and shows that the United States really doesn't care about tackling drug trafficking when it comes to powerful politicians like Hernandez being completely complicit in the trade. But an embarrassing chapter in America's embarrassing war on drugs. and more than anything else shows how powerful people always help powerful people, while people lower on the food chain, people less powerful with less influence, are unfairly targeted and persecuted to no end, while powerful politicians and rich people are able to walk away free. As it becomes more apparent, not just in organized crime, but all across the world, that powerful and influential people don't have to play by the same rules as the rest of us, and they can continue to do horrendous and awful things to all of us without facing any justice. All right, that's going to do it for this week's edition of Organized Crime News Weekly. Thank you so much for tuning in. Just want to remind everyone to please like, share, and subscribe so we can help grow this channel. Also, please make sure to support my channel. You can do that by just contributing $2.99 a month. Any contribution is greatly appreciated, and it helps me to continue making these videos. I'll be back next week to report on more stories concerning the global criminal underworld. Thank you so much for tuning in.